My talk will be on spatial planning as a key actor in developing and implementing nature-based solutions. My talk will predominantly focus on Germany, but hopefully some of my insights and perspectives are potentially transferable and can be also used and utilized for MBS implementation in African countries. I'm also in parallel coordinator of another European framework project on nature-based solutions on private land, but the spatial focus of this project is continental Europe. I will also share some insights from this project, predominantly the evidence base for nature-based solutions with you. However, my first talk will refer to Germany and German experiences in addressing climate risks and climate change and spatial planning and related approaches to develop and implement NBS. But I will also identify at the very end key enabling factors for NBS implementation that are, to me, also of importance for sub-Saharan African countries. First of all, I simply do not know whether all of you are familiar with the concept of spatial planning. In generally speaking, spatial planning aims to guide public policy interventions which are related to the regulation of land use. I do not know what kind of term is relevant for your country of origin. There are several alternative terms internationally used, such as town and county planning, urban planning, city planning, or land use planning. In Europe, at least, there's a common territorial agenda and also a common European adaptation strategy to climate change, and several related framework directives that point to environmental and climate-related issues such as a floods directive, nature restoration regulation, also environmental impact assessment directives, and so on and so forth. On the national level in Germany, we have adopted almost 20 years ago a first adaptation strategy, and climate adaptation as an issue was introduced also in the same year in 2008 in the Federal Regional Planning Act, and 3 years later in the Federal Building Code, which is the legal basis for municipal land use planning. Quite recently, the Federation came also up with a specific Climate Adaptation Act, which requires municipalities to develop an adaptation concept and related adaptation measures, predominantly nature-based solutions, on the evidence base of a so-called climate risk assessment. Guiding principle of spatial planning in Germany is, as in most countries, sustainable development. There are so-called concepts and strategies for spatial development in Germany, and a specific concept that addresses climate change-related challenges, mitigation as well as identification. And when looking at the related map, it becomes clear that there are certain place-specific climate risks Germany is threatened by, such as urban floods, river floods, coastal floods, urban heat and drought, also forest fire and landslide, rockfalls, etc., play a role in alpine parts of the country. As also shown by this map, there are several, let's say, climate regions being characterized by specific climate risk profiles, which requires, as in most countries, I guess, place-specific adaptation measures based on a place-specific climate risk assessment, which not only consider the climate risks themselves, but also the vulnerability of socioeconomic framework conditions to climate-related threats such as floods, heats, etc. Areas are, of course, more densely populated, which means that there's a higher vulnerability to heat, while rural areas are predominantly threatened by soil erosion, river flooding, and alpine hazards. Coming to the specific contribution of spatial planning, it's obvious that the urban form influences air quality and also urban heat. I guess all of you are well aware about the so-called urban heat island effect, as well as the predominantly sealed surface as a trigger factor for surface water runoff and urban flooding related challenges. When looking at the maps on the right, it becomes clear that there is predominantly on the regional level some opportunity to mitigate climate risks by, for instance, demarking priority zones, which are strictly binding for public authorities, including municipal land use planning, in order to keep ventilation channels free of settlement development to enable the inflow of fresh air into densely populated city centers, for instance. The map on the lower right identifies these kind of ventilation channels. This is an expert statement which was delivered by the Federal State Environmental Agency as a support for the development of a regional plan, which is shown by the map on the upper right. That makes clear that there's predominantly on the regional level a quite important contribution of spatial planning that aims to guarantee the implementability of adaptation actions, in particular nature-based solutions, by keeping suitable areas free of conflicting land uses. On the local level, as shown by the preparatory land use plan illustrated by the figure on the upper right and the legally binding land use plan shown by the figure on the lower right, it becomes clear that these are regulatory instances for steering the citywide development framework, which enables municipalities to identify areas for which green and blue infrastructure is of importance or even necessary to mitigate previously identified climate risks such as urban heat or flooding. While the legally binding land use plan, which is the basis for granting individual building permissions, aims to differentiate between different types of land uses in accordance to their vulnerability to various climate risks, but also their supports while identifying framework conditions for building permissions, the robustness of the building stock against previously identified climate risks, such as defining minimum elevation heights in order to avoid an inflow of water during intense rainfall events into the basement or the ground floor of buildings, or by keeping specifically vulnerable land uses such as hospitals and schools away from threatened areas. All of these issues can be managed by legally binding land use plans, which are binding for all actors, not only the municipality itself, but also private landowners. Coming to the concept of nature-based solutions and to what extent spatial planning can support the development and implementation of them. I guess the previous speakers have already sufficiently introduced the concept of nature-based solutions to all of you. That is why I can skip more or less these definitions, just to again acknowledge the fact that NBS are a so-called umbrella concept, which brings different components, strategic dimensions, a spatial planning dimension, also soft engineering dimension, also governance dimension, together under one integrated framework. These are different examples for nature-based solutions within spatial planning from Germany. There are greenings of courtyards, there's green in the city, or urban reconstruction of previous water courses, also specific building adaptation, or particularly for those social groups which are specifically vulnerable to heat, such as elderly. You can easily depict from the map in the center of this figure green corridors, which have been identified, preserved, kept free from settlement development in order to allow the inflow of fresh air into the city center. There are also transitions of former railway tracks to cycling courses, which serve also as ventilation channel for the inflow of cool air. On the right, you can identify scenario-based approaches, which are predominantly informed by a microclimatic modeling in order to identify, let's say, a climate-proof urban design concept based on a comparison of the existing land use patterns with the potential effects of the intended land use change on the microclimate. That is also shown by this figure from another city, which was an integrated part of a so-called environmental impact assessment, which shows an example for an assessment of the impact of the planned interventions on the microclimate in comparison to a baseline scenario, which is shown by the map on the upper left. On the upper right, you can see the planned interventions, predominantly green infrastructure or NBS, in order to mitigate the heat island effect. And on the lower right, you can identify the changes in the PET in Celsius in comparison to the baseline scenario, which represents the current land use. This enables decision makers to identify the added value of NBS from quantitative perspective, which is also a prerequisite for conducting cost-benefit assessments of NBS from an economic perspective, which is quite insightful also for public decision makers in order to justify investments on NBS by focusing on their positive, let's say, return of investment, not only on the microclimate, but also on the well-being of the people. This is another example from such kind of microclimatic modeling, which proves the positive effect in reducing air temperature and physical equivalent temperature up to 2 degrees Celsius, especially the implementation areas shown by the maps in the center of this figure already within the first 5 years. The calculated return of investment, the calculated investment cost is about 55,000 euro, which is more or less $60,000 for the reduction of 1 degree Celsius. These are examples from these kind of interventions, such as tiny forests or green infrastructure, also in private gardens. Another example from a modeling of the effects of reforestation on river flooding proved the positive effect on reforestation on the discharges in the majority of the situations, particularly on the delay of flood peaks by 1 to 2 days, enhancing plant transpiration by 3.5%, and also a reduction of surface water runoff by approximately 7%. These kind of evidence basis is at least in most countries indispensable requirement for justifying decisions on NBS and for weighting up the benefits of NBS and also potential trade-offs. Another example where implementation of surface water management system for stormwater management was integrated in the urban development concept. It shows that the implementation of NBS is not only beneficial for new developments, but also for existing already built-up areas in order to make them more climate-proof in view of predominantly or previously identified climate risks, such as in this case flooding. It's also an interestingly prerequisite for applying for funding. Setting up of an integrated urban development concept is, at least in Germany and in many other European countries, a prerequisite for public funding. Which is also true for the European Regional Development Fund, which requires public investors to conduct a so-called climate proofing when applying for public European money and for investments in public infrastructure. The investor has to conduct a climate risk assessment and to identify appropriate adaptation measures in order to avoid, minimize, or at least compensate identified climate risks, which implies that the investments which are required for the implementation of NBS are, at least under these framework conditions, up to the investor, but he benefits from the financial support of the European Regional Development Fund. To conclude with key enabling factors for NBS implementation, this is also a key lesson learned of our parallel European project. Access to land is, of course, this is probably self-explaining, but nonetheless it needs to be said. Access to land is indispensably required, as most of the urban areas, at least in Germany, but I guess also in African countries, is privately owned. And you cannot purchase all the privately owned land. You have to convince the landowners from the usefulness of implementing nature-based solutions on their land, ideally with the financial support of the city. Access to funding, of course, is also an important issue. As I just indicated, there are many funding schemes available in Europe by the European Commission, but also by the various member states, regions, and cities. But in all cases, an evidence base is required in order to justify investments in nature-based solutions. Examples of this kind of evidence were just shown by my presentation. However, there's also another insight from various projects I have been responsible for. There's a requirement for flexibility, structural flexibility, rather than uniform replication of best practices. The program architectures should consequently distinguish between elements that require standardizations, such as tools and modeling approaches, and those that must remain locally adaptable, specifically to be tailored to the socio-economic framework conditions, cultural beliefs, and demographic structures of the local environment. There's also a need to enable divergent local knowledge integration in problem framing, not only in solution refinement, to improve a sense of ownership of nature-based solutions, in particular for those interventions that are to be implemented on private land. Diversify evaluation criteria to reflect plural effectiveness perspective is also a must, which means that it's not only long-term ecological metrics that matter, but also short-term livelihood indicators. This is also what is meant with no-regret approaches. No-regret means that intervention is beneficial, respectively, from the magnitude of a potential future climate risk, because the current population benefits. It's an improvement for their livelihood, probably also for their income conditions. And finally, strengthening intermediary capacity while safeguarding knowledge priority is an issue, particularly for NGO and community-based organizations, which play a critical role in translating and mediating knowledge between communities and technical institutions such as universities. This intermediary capacity is a key enabling factor for making NBS implementation successful. Thanks for your attention. These are some publications I contributed to from the European Commission on nature-based solutions for sustainable climate adaptation, and also on the importance of climate proofing of investments in infrastructures in order to make them resilient.